All right, so I think we're about ready to start. Welcome, everybody. I think they're letting everybody in, and I see the record button in, and I was looking for the button that makes our appearances look better, and I can't find mine. I think mine is broken. So anyway, good evening. I am Vice Mayor Jim Schulman, and I serve on the board of the Women's Political Collaborative Tennessee. I appreciate you joining us for tonight's program on results and civility. Very important topic these days. If you are not a member of WPCTN, I encourage you to join. The programming they have offered over the last 6 months has just been phenomenal. So let me stop for just a second. I will tell you that we have a couple of groups on. I know we have a class from MTSU on that is joining. A class from Vanderbilt that's on. We have former Representative Bob McKee on. And I also understand that the Greene County Women's Democratic Party is on. So anyway, we welcome all those folks. So it's an honor for me to say that I've had the privilege of working with each of the panelists tonight and the moderator. So I served as Chief of Staff for former House Speaker Jimmy Nafee. Former Speaker Beth Harwell was my longtime state representative, and Jim Henry served as my deputy governor. And I served as a council member when Bill Purcell was mayor. They were all exceptional people, and I'm fortunate to call them all my friends. There could not be a better bipartisan group of lawmakers to discuss how friendships will always allow for common ground. It is with regret that I cannot stay and listen to this entire program as I have a Metro Council meeting tonight that I have to go down the hall and run, where I'm going to try to keep and hold everybody civil for the next 6 or 7 or 8 hours. I would tell you that after this program ends, you are welcome to tune us in, or you're welcome not to tune us in. Or you can go have dinner, catch a movie, and then you can come back and tune us in because we will probably still be here. I think Deborah Maggard is also joining us. Former Representative Deborah Maggard, I think, is also on this call. There will probably be a whole bunch of people joining in throughout this program. So I am now turning the program over to former House Majority Leader and former Metro Nashville Mayor Bill Purcell, who is going to lead tonight for a program that I'm sure is going to be very lively and informative. Mayor Purcell, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor, and thank you for not just kicking us off here, but for those nice words that you said about all of us. It will be interesting, I think, to see whether the council meeting tonight or this very special program has the higher television ratings. I don't want to make any predictions, but I know that we're going to have more fun than anybody, except when you are cheering them up. But other than that, it's hard work, and we appreciate your leadership in Nashville as you led, frankly, and helped so much in the legislature. But right now, it's the Metro Council that needs you, and Nashville needs you, and we know you'll have to be there. This is the best possible panel tonight to talk about this subject, with one possible exception. And I've thought about it, and the panelists may have a different thought. There's one person that would have added, and that's Ned McWhorter, because he was for so long Speaker and such a believer in both this subject, I think, and in the legislative process. But I like to think he's been waiting all week for this moment and watching from another place while I introduce 3 of the people that he knew well and knew, like him, loved the legislative process. Like Jim, I had the opportunity to serve with each of the people I'm about to introduce, and I'm the better for it. Beth Harwell and I actually both came to Nashville at slightly different times, but for the same purpose, for education. We both came from Pennsylvania, and we both went to Vanderbilt, which are 2 things that neither one of us mentioned a whole lot, at least in our early days of being in the legislature. There would be no special advantage necessarily in general, but we share that. But we also share having arrived, in my case, in '86 and hers in 1988. And then in Beth's case, she went on to become the Speaker of the House in 2011, served until 2019. I think many people watching will know she's awaiting confirmation to the Tennessee Valley Authority, and she was an outstanding leader throughout her service in the House, whether in the minority or the majority, and I'm very grateful that she could join us here tonight. Jim Henry was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1978. He and Lamar Alexander arrived together at an important time for Tennessee and for their leadership. I think that's certain. Within 2 years, he was elected minority leader. When he was elected, he was called minority leader. Once he moved into then he preferred being called rather Republican leader during that time. Later on, when the Republicans were in the majority, he preferred majority leader again. But that said, he was an outstanding minority leader and was in that role as I arrived in the House in 1986. He moved over to become the chairman of the Republican Party. There was a brief overlap of a couple of years, I think, in those two positions. He gave up then the leadership in the House in order to continue on as chairman of the party. He left the House in 1990, but he was terrific in all the things we're going to talk about, as well as a large number of policy areas. I think informed greatly by his service as mayor in Kingston from 1973 to 1979. 4 years in the Navy, 1 year in Vietnam. He shares a lot of the characteristics and the leadership skills of Jimmy Nafee. Jimmy was elected in 1974. He got there first, and he stayed the longest. He was elected Speaker in 1991, and it was my honor to be Majority Leader, begin my time as Majority Leader when he came in as Speaker of the House. And he served as Speaker through and across 2 decades. No one else has served as Speaker as long as he has, 18 years in that position, and a position of extraordinary leadership it is. Also a member of service in the U.S. Army from Covington, Tennessee. The subject is civility. The subject is results. The subject is what we learned when we were all there together, and at different times, I suppose, because we weren't all necessarily there at the same time. I am remembering actually an early meeting with Beth, then Haltman, now Beth Harwell, at a community meeting in Green Hills in her district. All of the legislative delegation was there, senators and House members. We were of both parties. There was a very angry group of retired teachers. I have no recollection of why they were so angry, but they were. And one of the teachers raised her hand and said, "I have a question. I demand an answer to my question. I don't care if you know the answer to my question. I want an answer." And we, as new members, looked at each other, Beth and I, and thought, I don't know the answer to that question. I have no clue. And what's going to happen now? And Douglas Henry stepped forward and he said, "Madam, I am a state senator. That means that I have an opinion on every subject. It does not necessarily mean that I have a basis for my opinion, but I have an opinion. I will express it now for all." In that moment, he lifted the political burden of that question from all of us, Democrats and Republicans, House members and senators. He handled it. I have no clear recollection of what he said or why, but when he was done talking, that was the end of that issue, and we went on to the next thing. There was that kind of civility. And so for the panel, as you think about those times and now, do you think that there's been a change of civility within the legislative process? You might talk a bit about the public process, but really let's focus first on the legislative process and the General Assembly. What was it like when you got there, and do you sense a change? And Speaker Nafee, as the longest serving speaker, I will call on you first.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for everything that you've done over the years. I want to start out by talking about Governor Alexander and Governor McWhorter. When Governor Alexander was elected, there was a lot of questions about whether or not he could get along with that rural Democratic House Speaker, Ned McWhorter. Well, Ned's response to that was, "I think my job as Speaker is to make you the best governor that I possibly can, because if you do well, the state does well." And I think that all of us, the four of us together, have lived by that way of doing business in the state. It kind of set the tone for Governor Alexander being the governor, and for Speaker McWhorter assisting him in what he did throughout his 8 years as governor. Governor Alexander also started the leadership breakfast at 7 a.m. on Wednesday mornings in his office. And it was a small group at that time. It was only the governor and his commissioner of finance and administration, the two speakers, Ned McWhorter and John Wilder, the leaders from the Senate, and at that time it was Milton Hamilton and Tom Garland, and the two from the House were myself and Jim Henry. And what we did in those meetings stayed in those meetings. You weren't able, let me rephrase that. We never thought about going outside and telling the press what we had discussed, because it was important that we bring the state forward with what we were all working together on, Democrats and Republicans, to make sure that the state was going in the right direction. And we did a great job. I think we did. Lamar, I give him a lot of credit for setting those meetings up. Jim and I became good friends at that time and have remained friends ever since then. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to?
Speaker, I know that you could take the rest of the hour, but if I could just jump in here for a moment and ask Jim Henry, you were there when the time Jimmy described. Were they as nice to you and Lamar as he says?
Wait just a second. He also has pictures of me pouring him coffee, and he has something, a little quote beside it too.
That was inserted. It was a very cordial thing. As you know, most Democrats and Republicans agree on 85 to 90% of the issues, and we go to war over 10% or 15%. And you know, at that time, we had a lot of things that were had an ethical situation involved with it. And of course, Governor Blanton was leaving office and had been highly criticized for being improper in a million different ways. And I think the Democrats took a lead also in correcting that. And so it gave us kind of a basis for a relationship, I think, that lasted the whole time I was there. And, you know, the one thing I remember more than anything probably about McWhorter is that, you know, he was a House member, and he kind of told us that, you know, although we're going to be loyal to the governor's office and what the governor wants, we're House members, so we're not one unit. And I always remembered that in my dealings with Lamar. And I was very loyal. I don't know the thing any of the Republicans ever did that, you know, that wasn't loyal, but we also understood that we were members of the House, which is, you know, there's three divisions of our government. And so, but it was very cordial. We never spoke of anything that we discussed. I mean, we always, our normal response on the question would be, this is what I said about that issue. And if you want to know what Jimmy Nafee said, you need to ask Jimmy Nafee. But we never discussed what someone else said. The other thing that Governor McWhorter, that Speaker McWhorter and Speaker Wilder they were very constructive. They weren't negative. They weren't trying to hurt the state. I mean, we were all trying to bring the state around. And it was a very difficult time. It was a time that, you know, I remember our first road programs that we passed. There hadn't been a road program passed since 1929 when we passed the first road program. And we did it because pretty much General Motors and Nissan said, if you want more car manufacturers, you're going to have to build a better road system. And so at that time, you know, it was very common for governors to go out and promise a road from, you know, Johnson City to Kingsport. And they'd go out and drive a stake in the ground, and a year later, they'd move it 1 mile. And they did the same thing on Highway 64 along the bottom of Tennessee. And so we put all those together and put a road program together. And I don't know if you've been out. I've had an opportunity now that we've had, you know, some time during this COVID situation to travel. There is no better roads. There are no better roads anywhere in this country than in this state. And it makes you very proud of some of those things. And it was, Alexander was an interesting leader. He didn't like controversy. And I think he paid due respect, which is a key to getting along if you respect each other in their positions. Not necessarily not particularly like someone, but if they're a majority leader, they deserve a certain amount of respect. And so it was a very positive situation the whole time I was in the General Assembly. I enjoyed it under Alexander. I enjoyed it under McWhorter.
Well, and Beth, you had the opportunity to see both Jims and both Jim and Jimmy be in positions of leadership, and lots of other leaders during the course of a long and distinguished career. As the first woman speaker, obviously, you had a chance to, in particular, bring another perspective to it. How did you find it then, and how did you see it change?
Thank you, Bill. And I'm so happy to be a part of this dialogue tonight. I really saw my job a little bit different because I saw myself as kind of a transitional speaker. My party, the Republican Party, was moving from being just a political party to actually being the governing party of the state. For the first time ever, we had the governor, the Senate, the state Senate, and the state House. And so it was a question of not could we get it done, because obviously we had the votes in all of the chambers and with the governor, but was it the right thing to do? And so I really saw my role a little bit differently. I didn't anticipate staying in the speakership for a long time. I saw myself moving my party to being not just the party that sat there on the House floor, which is what the minority party often does, and just throw bombs and kind of cause some controversy, but then truly accepting the responsibility of governing our state. And it was a job that I truly loved. But before this night gets away from us, I have to share one of my favorite mementos that Jimmy Napie will appreciate. When I was elected speaker, there were some within my caucus, one of which was one of my biggest supporters, Philip Johnson, a state rep from Cheatham County, who voted for me and supported me, but he was a little nervous that I would not be as tough as Jimmy Napie. Now, Jimmy, you can sit there and smile, but let me tell you something, everybody feared you. And there were people that said that I was not going to be as tough as Jimmy. So when I was elected, Philip came to my office and he said, I have a gift for you. And I will show it to you all tonight. It was a little band that said WWJD. And I said, oh, Philip, thank you so much. That's so kind. And I'll try to live by that. And he said, do you know what it means? And I said, well, yes, of course. What would Jesus do? And he said, no. What would Jimmy do? And he said, Beth, you got to get tough to get this house in order and get them all on the same page. And that was indeed a challenge to get that body, which is a rowdy, diverse group of people. And I'm proud that they are, because this is a diverse state, all walking on the same page to support our majority party.
Well, and I appreciate especially you're focusing on that, because leadership obviously requires some toughness and a certainty about where you're headed. I was wondering, as you also think about your leadership, and I'm going to ask both Jim and Jimmy to talk about it, what was the importance of the other side, of the sort of soft power and of friendship, for that matter, colleagueship? Do you think that's a part of the body, a part of our history? How important is it? Or put another way, are friendships possible? From people looking at from the outside in, it's not clear how that can work in a place that often appears so contentious. But talk a little bit about the role of that soft power and of friendship and colleagueship.
Well,
Absolutely.
Bill, it's obvious that Jim and Beth and I are all served together, and we're extremely good friends. I mean, good friends, not just casual friends. So, Beth, I didn't mean to go ahead of you.
No, you go right ahead.
I'm done. Go ahead.
Well, from my perspective, there is such an important role for the minority, or as we say, opposition party, to bring forth ideas to make whatever the majority party wants to do better. And I'll give a perfect example, quite frankly, one where you were a part of it, Bill. When Governor Sundquist was elected, and this was under President Clinton, he gave the states the authority to reform welfare as we knew it. And Sundquist came forward with a program, Families First. It was the first major piece of legislation that the governor ever asked me to sponsor. And I was challenged. I was nervous about doing it. And I came forward, and honestly, there were a lot of good things about that program. I knew it was going to pass, but I remember in committee you coming forward with ideas to make it a better program. And I believe that's the role of the minority party. And as far as friendships, you know, here's the bottom line. You treat people the way you would like to be treated. And if you do that with your colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, I do think it makes for a better setting.
Jim?
Well, I just always thought that, you know, you could determine the quality of the majority by how it treated the minority. And, you know, I'm sure that if you don't treat them right, that there will be a reckoning, as some people used to talk about. But the only time I think that we really had difficulties was on 4 or 5 issues. And when that time would come, everybody knew that it was going to be a difficult day. And everybody, you know, went to their principles and they fought it as hard as they possibly could. And, you know, Ed Blank taught me something one time. I went over to the Senate and watched him debate. And he was on an issue that I don't even remember what it was, but he was debating. They debated all afternoon on the bill, as emotional and difficult as it was. And when it was over, he lost. And immediately went to the guy that had led the opposition and shook hands and said, "You got me that time." You know, and it just meant something to me. And Tom Garland was that type of person. And, you know, it teaches you a lot to be around people. And I listened a lot. I didn't just go in with all the answers. I always thought, you know, that a good thing for a member to do would be to sit around for a while and listen and find out what it's all about. Because no one, if you hadn't been there, has that experience.
I totally agree. Beth, you mentioned that a particularly good example, I think, of bipartisanship, a bill that was enabled by a Democratic president, that was acted upon by a Republican governor, that was sponsored by Republicans in houses where there were Democratic majorities. And in the end, what was passed at that time, and I think still is believed to be the best example in the country of that reform that met the needs of all those who were concerned about the program and who wanted to grow the program. But bipartisanship since that time has become, well, at least in some parts of the country, less attractive. There's an article in Governing Magazine from August the 20th, and I'm quoting now: "The long-standing trend toward polarization will clearly continue, with voters ready to punish apostates and offering few rewards to legislators who reach across the aisle." Quote, "We see very similar divisions in these primaries for Republicans and Democrats. Bipartisanship is going to be theoretically even harder." Is that the future? Is that where we're headed? Does it have to be that way? Should it be that way?
Are you going to call on us, or do you want us to just respond?
Speaker, I think you should go.
Well, I don't think that's the way it should be, and I hope that's not the future, because there's so many things that can be done in a bipartisan fashion, and it's not difficult to do that. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Is Annabelle came up with an idea about the community mental retardation agencies in this state, and that we needed to improve them. And Jim and I rode together one entire summer and visited every community mental retardation agency in this state. Now,
26 of them.
I'm sorry.
26 of them.
Yeah.
There was 26 agencies.
And you know, it wasn't just the two of us. There were other members, Democrats, Republicans. We all worked together toward the common goal of trying to make well, actually, we were trying to get the money in the right places, because at the time, 80% of the money went to 20% of the clients in the hospitals, and 20% of the money went to 80% of the folks that were in the community mental retardation agencies. This was a big thing, and we worked at that entire summer, very bipartisan. That's the way things need to work. That's how things work when they're really working well, is you got Democrats, Republicans, all working toward the same goal. And Bill, I'm going to talk about a bill you sponsored, which was Ned McWhorter's basic education program. You handled that bill for Governor McWhorter, and standing beside you in the well was a Republican from Upper East Tennessee named Alan Hubbard. And I think he delivered you some 23 or 24 Republicans on that bill, and you passed it with flying colors. And that's another good example of a bipartisan working relationship to do something good for the state of Tennessee.
Well, and that education bill did pass with a very strong bipartisan support, and frankly, much as the welfare reform program that Beth sponsored passed, as the education reform that Jim Henry passed in the House with support of Democrats when Lamar was the governor. Jim, though, you picked up that idea, or the legislature did, but I think with your leadership, that idea of working together and looking around. And when I got there, and when Beth got there, there was a select joint committee on corrections. There was a select joint committee created on children and youth, which were committees truly bipartisan, all regions. Talk a little bit about that, particularly in corrections, another area that is often not front of mind for people, but it was a passion for you and for Jimmy, and I know for others.
Well, there were so many things that we needed to do. They talk about juvenile justice reform, and there were so many people we thought at that time. Of course, there's more than that now, I think, but so many people in prisons, and all you'd have to do to get more people was build a new prison. You'd fill it up immediately, and so there was a real need, and it went more than just from one administration to the other. And I remember the first tax bill we passed way back there, and a lot of it went to corrections department. And of course, you can't pay tax, you can't raise taxes. So we did it in the name of, most of it went to education, but a lot of that money that was sold on education, some of it did go to corrections and trying to alleviate the problems they had. But it wasn't. I mean, the thing I think it was so different in is these were really huge issues, and they weren't so much emotional issues, but they were people issues. And when you're talking about a person wasting away in a prison, for maybe something they've done, maybe something they hadn't done, but we visited all the prisons one time. We visited all the highway patrol stations at one time because we had a huge problem that still exists, I think, in some places. But it was a mentality that we were all moving forward to try to make the state better. I always remember Governor McWhirter, when we would be close on a vote, the Alexander administration, he'd come to me and say, Jim, I'm going to give you 11 Democrats, so you need to produce 39 Republicans, which was all of them. And we're going to pass this, and it passed. But there was just a lot of civility that it seems like it doesn't exist anymore because you don't have that opportunity to get together like we did. We went to conferences together. We usually had a reception each night that we went together. There was someone that wanted from our districts or something, wanted to take us to dinner. We'd go to dinner together, and it's a lot easier to make laws and be civil when you're breaking bread with somebody and you become a friend. I think Congress got away from that, and that's one of the reasons, the problems that they have. But this is a very difficult and emotional time, and I see a change in people that come to Nashville. When I went there, I was an economic development director for my county. I mean, not really, but I was, and Parks Recreation, and we were expected to bring some things home, and that's what we wanted to do. I'm not sure that there's much of that goes on today.
Well, Beth, go ahead, Beth, please.
I would be remiss if I didn't say that I don't want to sugarcoat this. It's when I was in the super minority, it's not like everything was rosy. I mean, as much as I adored Governor McWhirter, I do think he was a great governor. He was also the man that said that Republicans are like boll weavers. They need to be stomped out. I mean, I can remember sponsoring legislation. I just recollected a piece of legislation I had that upped the qualifications to be a school bus driver. So that you didn't have a criminal background, that you went through certain training. I thought it was a great piece of legislation. It had support. And chairman of transportation committee that I loved, Rob Robinson, came to me. He said, "Love you," and I said, "I love you." He said, "This is a great piece of legislation." I said, "Well, great." He said, "If you want to get it done, you need to sign it over to Dennis Ferguson because he'll get it done for you." And I went, "What?" I had to give my piece of legislation over to a Democrat in order for it to pass. So I would be remiss for our viewers tonight to say that everything is always, I mean, there's a part for partisan politics. It will always exist within the political spectrum. I think the difference that we see is that a true statesman at the end of the day sits back and says, what issues are so large for our state that we need to set it all aside and do what's right? You know, I never enjoyed representing a district that was safe. I didn't have a district that was a Democrat district or a Republican district. I was in a district that was really a 50-50 district. So never was there a time when people sat back and said, oh, well, let her have the race. It was always a challenge for me. Even when I was speaker, I had opponents, okay? So it does put it in a different perspective when that does exist. But I will say this, I think the difference today is the issue of civility is that we tend to look at people we don't agree with and demonize them instead of saying we have two different views here. Whether those two different views are Republican versus Democrat or liberal versus conservative, that I don't have a problem with. I have a problem with when we look at our opponent and they are an evil person because they don't agree with me.
Beth, in that regard, one of the changes people often identify from the time when we arrived and today is the addition of social media and the ability of people to communicate. When you and I arrived, and I think this was true for most of Jim and Jimmy's, certainly the 80s and 90s, if you came into your office and you had 5 letters sitting on your desk from somebody who actually lived in your district, you were thinking it was a groundswell out there, and you better get to that right now. Well, the days of 5 letters, I'm thinking, are decades ago now, because with the push of a button, you suddenly think there is a nuclear altercation underway. How has that had an effect from your perspective on behavior?
Absolutely. You know, two thoughts I have on that. Number one, the blog world has simply cheapened communication. And, you know, people have sent me things or said things about me that they would never say to my face, or would they sit down and write a letter and express that to me, or even a telephone call, because they don't have to identify who they are. They don't have to take responsibility or verify what they've said. So I do think that although communication is easier, it's not necessarily better. And I would add to the whole idea of a 24/7 news cycle has led legislators both here at the state level, but much more so at the federal level, to be more concerned with a soundbite than on one of the continuing news cycles, as opposed to sitting down at the table and trying to work something out.
Well, to both Jim and Jimmy, when you arrived, there were, I think, at least 2 reporters or 3 in the Capitol from Memphis. There was a reporter from Jackson. There were 3, 4, or 5, depending on the day, reporters, print reporters from Nashville. There were a couple from Knoxville, a couple from Chattanooga. There was one from Upper East Tennessee. There was an AP reporter. There was a UPI reporter, and that's just the print reporters. There was a lot of press attention, but that particular aspect's not there. How did the press affect this working relationship in those days? And do you think the change in press coverage has been a help or a hindrance to this kind of civility?
You want Jim or I to answer this?
Yeah, yes, whoever.
Respond, not answer, but respond.
Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, with all the this media and instantaneous responses to everything, it's no telling what kind of trouble I'd have gotten into while I was speaker if all this were in effect back then. But we knew the reporters, they knew us. They either trusted you or they didn't, and you either had a good relationship with the press or you didn't. I seem to have always had a good one because I was available to the press. But back to it's a different day. things are different today than they were when we were there. It's kind of like Beth said, the 24-hour news is maybe all this isn't so good as we thought it was going to be. But I'm glad that that we were there in the time period that we were.
I think it's done a lot to change politics. You know, as much as sometimes I disagreed with the media, they usually were capable people that did a fairly good job of reporting the news. They might do it in a way that I didn't like, slanted in a way. But I'll tell you something, this, depending on the blog for information of some truth involved with it, is just, you can't do it. And, you know, everyone knows the effect that newspapers now are just, I mean, there's less and less of them, less people read them. People are looking to the internet for their information, and they're going on TV, and that's not nearly as good a source. And I'll tell you something, I think it's hurt politics a lot. I mean, when you had those different reporters, different newspapers across the state, you know, they got it right a lot of the times. And I think it helped people. And people read the newspaper. And like I say, I didn't always agree with them, but I think that it's had a detrimental effect on politics because of the way that we get our information now.
And Beth makes a very good, I think, point of putting each of these time periods in perspective. Up until the 1960s, the legislature had very little leadership function. It was very much a gubernatorial, not just here, but across the country. Legislators weren't given copies of the budget. Legislators had no offices. Legislators had no staff, or really meeting every other year. The executive was largely in control, and the legislature responded. It's in this modern legislative period that change has occurred, and I think Beth makes an important point that no one on this, I think, program is saying we should go back. But what I hear a little bit is going forward, there are opportunities for change always. And so when you think about good changes that might occur, especially to create perhaps more collaboration or more of a sense of the focus being the result as opposed to the battle, what thoughts do you have about how going forward, especially in Tennessee, but in the country, in other legislatures, that might be accomplished?
Just a point on that. You know, if you've looked at any other of the other legislatures across this country, we are in such great shape as far as the kind of legislature we have, the power it takes and doesn't take. I mean, the executive in the state is a powerful individual. In lots of places, you know, you can go to legislative meetings and they take great pride in taking the governor's budget and throwing it out the window and starting over. That doesn't do much. I mean, you know, you've got a governor that's supposed to lead this state. And I think in the 40s, they changed the Constitution in the state where we had a very powerful, you know, before that you had a commissioner system of government. And it was kind of like Texas where commissioners ran the state. And now you've got a very strong executive. I think people like that. I think it does well. Of course, they don't, you know, you always get complaints from the executive branch about the legislature taking too much authority, but, you know, you got a $40 billion budget and the legislature fools with $1.5 billion. I mean, you know, don't take it too seriously. They give the governor pretty much what he wants. And so he's responsible too for the way he spends it and what he's done. And quite frankly, Democrats and Republicans in this state have done a wonderful job of putting us in good shape all over this country as far as government's concerned. Low taxes, quality of life, jobs we've brought here, all of those things.
Well, and Jim Henry, of course, knows that from both branches. He's the one member of this panel who has served in both branches and most recently served as commissioner and deputy governor. So I, for the audience, some of whom may not remember that as well as you do and I do, it's important to know that there's a lot of experience behind that comment.
You know, I've always had a great respect for government, and I always thought it was very essential. And you know, there's some people that dislike government; they hate it. But you know, Annabelle Clement had a great saying. You know, government sends kids to school. It helps people with disabilities. It feeds the hungry when they're, in a desperate situation. It helps protect us. It does a lot of good things. It builds highways and sewers and schools, and you can go on and on. And, most people, when they say, I don't like government, I think they don't really recognize what they're saying. But you want it run as efficiently. It's not an efficient government. If you changed heads of a company as many times as we changed the heads of the state of Tennessee, I mean, you'd never build a car. But, I was CEO of my company for 17 years. And, that's a long time. But if you look, most companies do. And to think about taking a new administration every 4 to 8 years, throwing everybody out, changing them, getting their own new board of directors, which is the legislature. It's a very difficult system, but we made it work better than anybody else in the country.
Annabelle also said, and she said it quite often, politics is a beautiful word. And you remember that, I'm sure you do. But
I sure do.
something that you talked about earlier, and that is, it has to do with how the Democrats and Republicans, whether they get along or not, but some of the ethics bills that we passed that back, I guess, right before Governor Haslam came into office, it had a whole lot to do with whether or not folks are getting to see and know each other very well the way we used to. Now, I'm not saying that it was wrong. I'm just saying that we should have been a little more careful about what we did. I know that my office and Beth had the same thing. Was the speaker's office got to be the place where people would come and be able to have conversation with each other after hours. Have a Coke or glass of orange juice or whatever, but some refreshments. And
Speaker, I don't remember any orange juice in your office. Was there orange juice there? Maybe it was a mixer of some kind.
Maybe it was.
I don't know.
Beth,
Okay.
as you know, people wanted to be able to get together, but they weren't able to. And then our offices seemed to be the place where folks would gather up in the afternoons after business hours.
Sure,
Beth?
and that's true. If you know someone personally, it's much more difficult to say something ugly about them. That's just the reality in every walk of life. I think to Bill's question, I think for the next generation coming along, and I know we have some Vanderbilt and MTSU students on here, and I commend all of them for being a part of this. It's really important for them to be involved in the process, and I think it's also important for them to find a party that they're comfortable, that they understand the basic platform of that party, but then also understand that extremisms on either end, either right or left, don't move this country forward. They polarize us. And so at the end of the day, whether you see extremism on the left or extremism on the right, at the end of the day, that doesn't move our state, our nation forward. You need to bring forward. I'm not talking about compromising your principles. I'm talking about understanding that this is a diverse state, a diverse nation, and we need to be understanding and kind to one another.
And Beth, that reminds me of what Governor McWhorter told us. This was when he was out of office and Bill Clinton was the president, and Clinton asked Ned to come to Washington to advise him. And McWhorter was he didn't want a desk, he didn't want a phone, he didn't want a title, and he didn't want a salary. So what Governor McWhorter was able to tell President Clinton was, park yourself in the middle of the road and leave it there. Now he used more graphic explanation of what he was saying, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. And that's along what you just said, Beth.
And I think that, even with the problems of civility around the country and in Congress, especially, but I think you got some people in Tennessee that still are very cordial in dealing. I mean, in the Senate and House, I can name you 5 or 6 that worked with, and they were always very cordial and respectful to each other. All of them in a certain degree were helpful. Senator I don't know if you, I'm sure you know Mark White. I remember working with him, Harold Love, Patsy Hazelwood, Senator Richardson. I mean, all of those people were what I would call interested in civility. And so, we get sometimes overreactive to things that happen in Washington, and sometimes they happen here, but not nearly as much as they do, I don't think, in other states.
I think I remember, Jim Henry, that you used to sometimes carpool with the senator from your area.
I did. We carpooled. Annabelle and I carpooled together. Representative Tommy Burnett, he was quite a character, and he and I and Annabelle would ride down on Monday and Monday morning early, or we'd ride down on Sunday evening. And we had another guy that rode with us occasionally and drove us occasionally, Representative Peabody Ledford, that is notorious, and he's having some health problems now. But it was. I think it was a time. You talked about, Beth said something about, yes, it was partisan. Well, I remember when I went into Calendar and Rules, and there was no Republicans on the Calendar and Rules Committee. Well, if you went to a meeting, how in the world could you get your bill up if you couldn't even get a motion in a second, you couldn't get a vote on it? So the second year that I was there, Governor McWhorter changed the rules to where we would have 2 members. And then about the same time, I went into a rules committee, and to change that, Jim McKinney shows up and tells everybody that I'm trying to take over the legislature because we asked for 2 members off the 23 that were on the Calendar and Rules Committee. So it was very partisan, and I understand why Governor McWhorter did it. Was because when the Republicans were in power in 69 and 70, with a single vote from an independent, there weren't any Democrats on it either. And Governor McWhorter was a new member, went to the Calendar and Rules Committee and couldn't get a second. And the chairman of the Calendar and Rules Committee, which was a Republican, told him that if he wanted to get this bill passed, he could go get a Republican sponsor. So we've been, back and forth each party about that. But I think all in all, the quality of Tennessee's House and Senate and governorship is pretty darn good.
From you're all still close observers of politics here, and people tend to think about what they see on their news channels or national news and what's happening, especially in a presidential election year. But in thinking about recent elections within the state, would you say that we are moving more towards civility? I'm particularly thinking about some aspects, perhaps, of the last governor's election and other things. Do you think we're moving more towards civility or more toward that national divisiveness? And I'm also interested in at the district level. Do you think do you see a trend in the elections and the results and the candidacies, or not?
Unfortunately, I'm going to say that I believe we're moving the wrong way. I think we're getting more divided. And it seems like the different groups that have more, cause more divisiveness. They have less interest in working with each other. And I don't know why that is. One thing is the destruction of the parties. There's not much of a Democrat or Republican Party left in the state, really, if you look and see what it's organized to do. I mean, Republican Party in all these counties was a huge organization at one time. It's not anymore. And it has very little power to it. There's a lot of Republicans, a lot of Democrats, but the organizations don't hardly exist anymore in most of these counties, if you go look at them. And it's a few people that are involved. But I think we're the worst for that because I think most people are, looking at candidates instead of looking at what they stand for. That's not good.
Jim, I agree with you. And I think a lot of this comes about because they look at what's going on in Washington and they see how divisive they are and how partisan they are. And I guess they feel like they need to do that at the state level. I'm not sure if that's the reason, but it certainly it's certainly here, and it's not good, and it needs to be corrected.
Yeah, and it's different. When I was Republican leader, did you catch that, Bill?
I did.
When I was Republican leader, I could be called up to the governor's office. Governor Alexander would say, "We're going to meet at the bridge at 6 o'clock, and we need 43 Republicans to jump in." Well, you can't get 43 Republicans for anything, but I could get 41. And we could enter and jump in, but there was a loyalty to that office and making the system work that I'm not sure it enjoys a presence anywhere. Washington, Nashville, the local governments. Where we're really in trouble and where it really needs help is not the state government, but the national government and the local governments are all having difficulties right
Well, let me tell you, first of all, that you have foreseen and answered, in my opinion, and I guess as the moderator, I get to have an opinion, the questions that came through on chat. You really have. You've spoken to them very directly. And I'm in a moment, and Beth, you began this, and I was very impressed, as I'm sure the audience was, with what I took for advice to not just the world, but especially to those people that are thinking, at whatever age they may be, about becoming involved, whether it's the state or some other level of government. So I'm going to, while you're thinking about that, I'm going to tell a story about this title issue, which we've touched on twice and not made clear for the purposes of this program. So there's a new majority leader. It's me, and I guess a lot of people were surprised. I may have been a little bit surprised. And I went to my first meeting in the governor's office, and Ben Atchley, who is really in this space, I think one might say, a model of this kind of civility and working across aisles and urban and rural, and gentle Ben was just that, but at the same time a tall tree in the legislature. So we're sitting there, and he very, very, very seriously said, "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I really think we should get rid of this majority and minority. It doesn't send the right signal. We should just identify ourselves as what we are, and so I think you, Bill, should be the Democratic leader and not the majority leader, and I should be the Republican leader in the Senate and not the minority leader." And I said, "Well, Senator, I really appreciate you saying that, but I think you're welcome to use any title you want, but I kind of like majority leader." He said, "Oh no, Bill, that's not good at all." And so Ben had the minority leader scraped off of his plaque, and he had Republican leader put up there, and that lasted, Beth, just as long as it took Ben to become the majority party in the Senate, and Ben just scraped that designation off and put majority up right quick and lived happily ever after, in my opinion. But that's what that's all about. Now, having given you a moment to think about it, this is a moment, not that you won't ever get to do it again, but you've got 5 minutes. And what advice do you have to the world, especially those people who are thinking at whatever age they may be? And we all know people who have come to the legislature in their 20s, and we know people who have come to the legislature a lot later in life. What advice would you have now about how to work and improve this process?
Well, first of all, I think when a new member gets elected, I think their first term or so, they need to be able to look, listen, and see what's going on. I've seen where some members get elected in November and are pre-filing bills before they're ever sworn in. I don't think that's the route a person ought to take, but I've seen that happening recently. I would encourage new members to get around, meet their colleagues, know who they are, what they stand for, how well they can get along, and sponsor bills together. Always be ready to know what's in legislation before you determine that you're going to sign on as a co-prime sponsor. You know, you're not judged by how many bills you pass or sponsor. You shouldn't be. A lot of it goes as to how many bills you can get up on that floor and debate and bring out good points and bad points of legislation.
Jim?
Well, let me urge every person that's thinking about making a contribution to their country, their state. I mean, public services, there is nothing like it. I mean, it changes you in so many ways, and you have a chance to change things that you could work for your whole life. You can change things in 5 minutes. Some of the things we've done for people with disabilities, Bill, you've been part of that, Jimmy, Beth, you've all done that. Things we've done for that population in Tennessee is unbelievable. What we've done for children in the state is unbelievable. I'm very proud to be part of that. And you can't be part of that unless you take part in government. And, you know, I don't think that anybody ought to be a career politician, but there's certainly nothing wrong with them, you know, putting themselves forward, running for some office. It doesn't have to be the state legislature, but even the city council. We have such a need for good people that have no agenda except what's best for this state. And so I would urge you to get involved in government. It's good. It makes things happen, and it's really what every young person ought to experience at least once in their life.
And I'll follow up with that, Jim. I mean, even if you choose not to run for office, since it's not right for everyone, you can certainly participate in the process, whether it's voting. I mean, we have a dismal voting record, and we need to increase the number of people who vote in the state. If you want to just be involved in a campaign, I have learned more about myself and other people through the political process than anything else I've done in life. I mean, you will learn a lot through it. And I will tell you that I think for most average good Americans, Tennesseans, they are hungering and thirsty for someone who will present themselves with strong convictions, but with kindness and with the ability to remain calm and show leadership skills. And I do think that America is ready and willing to accept a person like that. So, and that's my hope. I mean, that's my hope as we move forward. We've gone through a time of great turmoil in our nation, not so much in our state, but in our nation. And I look forward to a time when, you know, all of us can remain true to our principles, but also show a level of civility to one another.
Well, I don't know how
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to talk about some of the legislation and the very bipartisan bills that you had passed, and how many were bipartisan, how many were partisan when you first came in. I think you've got a story there, and I wish you'd tell it.
Well, I will, Speaker, if the Women's Political Collaborative will invite us back. We have actually come to the end of our hour, and I can't think of a better conclusion to the overall remarks of this distinguished and extraordinary panel than what Speaker Beth Harwell just said. It was a perfect conclusion. I join. I think everyone on the call. You can't see all the chat, but people are there. You'll be pleased to know that there's not a single disagreement with the things that you all have been saying on the chat. In fact, a vast amount of encouragement to the notion of civility and bringing people together. And I want to thank Joyce McDaniel in particular, because she is an irresistible force who brought us all to this place. She simply called and insisted, and I think each of us said, well, of course, Joyce, whatever you want, because the answer no is impossible with Joyce McDaniel. So to the panelists, to Jim Henry and to Jimmy Nafee and to Beth Harwell and to Jim Schulman for hosting us and starting us off, I want to say thank you all very, very much. And Jimmy's right, we all have lots more stories, and some of them we can tell, and we'd be happy to. Take care, and good night to everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.